Welcome to part 2 of how to get that leadership job. So part 1 covered off how to get a leadership job in your current organisation using some tips that can show your leader how you are ready for leadership and can take that next step. So part 2 is about having put into place the steps in part 1, how you can get a leadership job outside of your current organisation, even without having had that formal leadership role prior. Today we'll cover off some key tips for your cover letter and your CV and how to get through that interview. For those of you who are new to my channel, I'm Nikki. I've been in leadership for 17 years. I've gone from a small team of 2 to growing a team of over 300, leading leaders on various different locations. I've also interviewed a lot of aspiring leaders, so hopefully some of that experience will help you in your journey. So you've seen a leadership role advertised in a different organisation and you really want to go for it. The first thing that I would just say here is have a good look at the role that's advertised and make sure that they're not asking for someone with 6 years leadership experience and that it really is suitable for someone who's an aspiring leader. So it may say things like leadership experience and advantage, which to me means it's an advantage, but it's not necessarily an essential. I wouldn't spend time trying to apply for senior leadership roles because that'll take a lot of energy and you're very likely to get a lot of knockbacks. Well, unless of course your dad owns the organisation and perhaps he's told you that you need to go for that job. The first thing I do is research on the organisation that's advertising. So I'll go on their website and I'll do some searches around any media that may have come out about them or any news articles, and I'll have a look and see if I can work out how big they are. Also look for who might be currently doing the role that they're advertising, because that can give you some really key insight around how many people report to them. And if they have a bio on the website, you may even see what they've done prior to that role. That will give you an idea of what they might be looking for in the new recruit. Looking for more information on the organisation can also give you a really good feel about whether or not you really want the role there. It can also give you some insight into what they might be looking for. So for example, if you discover there's been some recent media around a restructure with that organisation, that would probably tell me that they could be looking for somebody who can deal with change and growing a bit more of a team culture and engagement. It will depend on the level of leader that they're looking for as to how much this might impact your role, but it's always good information to know, especially leading into a potential interview. If the job description isn't included in the advertisement, I would take the opportunity to email the contact person and ask if you can have a copy. The job description also gives you a lot of insight into the key skills and attributes that they're looking for in the person they want to hire. But also remember, the job description is what they want to see somebody who's competent in the role doing. It isn't necessarily what you have to have already done fully to get the role, because as someone who hires people, I don't necessarily want to hire someone who's already got it all nailed, because chances are they're not going to stay for very long because another opportunity will pull them away. Once I have the job description, I go through it fully and match up anything that I think is experience that I could use as an example of how I've shown what they're asking for in that job description. So I'll make notes on the job description and highlight sections where I know I could be a match that could work for this role. Think about all those things that you put in place in part 1 and where you stepped up to take the lead in something, so that you can use those as part of your examples. So for example, if the description says that you'll be leading a team of 3, then think of when you've led a small group of people. Maybe it's on a project or some way that you've stepped up and taken the lead. It's all about using those experiences like we talked about in part 1 to match you up, so that even if you haven't had the official title of being a leader, you've shown that you have the ability to do so and have the examples of when you've done so. You can then craft your cover letter around what you've put together from the job description and the advertisement. So I would be looking at the advertisement as it usually highlights the really key factors that they're looking for in the person that they want to hire, and it's quite short, so you'll get it condensed into what they really want. I would do my cover letter around what their advertisement is asking for, and then think about how quickly
I can show that I've already got what they're asking for in a really short space of time.
So I really like cover letters on one page. So when I am interviewing somebody for a role, or when I'm going through a whole bunch of applications, I like to be able to glance down at the applications and see them all set out on one page really clearly. It also shows that you have the ability to be precise with your language, which is part of communication and a very critical skill for a leader. I have changed organisations where I didn't have any networks or connections, and so it was all done based on what I submitted in my cover letter and my CV, and my cover letter was 4 paragraphs and fitted on one page. It could have been 11.5 font, but it still fitted on one page. Don't try and recycle cover letters from other job applications. I think generic cover letters are overused and they're quite easy to spot. So if they start with "Dear Sir" or "Madam," I think that's the key point that you could probably get an advantage. When you contact the person asking for the job description, or even just contact the person and ask them this question, I would be asking, can you tell me who I can address my application to? So then you can personalise it in the cover letter and it stands out to them straight away. Cover letters are quite tricky to master, and I've learned over the years that being precise is quite challenging. So if anybody wants to hear more about some tips on cover letters, I can do another deep dive on this in a later video. Just post it in the comments. Now for your CV. Make sure your CV is structured really clearly and cleanly, and don't make it really long. My CV is 3 pages and starts with a section on qualifications and then a section on my work experience. And I've had, I think, 10 roles which are outlined in my CV. However, I don't list all the responsibilities that I've had for each of those 10 roles. I really only highlight the ones that are really relevant for the role that I'm applying for. So if it's a senior leadership role, I'd be using the last 2 roles from my experience, for example. And then I look at the responsibilities that I had for those roles and look at the job description and what they're looking for and see if there's anything that's a match, because then I'd put that as one of the responsibilities that I list, because I really only put sort of 4 bullet points on key responsibilities under each of those job titles. And then for my other experience, I still list it, because one of the other things that you notice when you're recruiting people is any long gaps in a CV. So you don't want to ignore years where you've had experience in a role that's completely separate, because then it looks like you haven't had a job. So I would just put the job title and the years that I was there. So for example, I was a recruitment consultant for a while, and while that HR experience is quite helpful and quite helpful for this video, it's not necessarily the main thing that I want to be highlighting if I'm applying for a certain type of leadership role. However, I include it as just one line. So try and adapt your CV for each new role and adapt those responsibilities to see if you can find some matches. Don't make it up though, it's got to be your real experience. And also, this process can take a little bit of time. However, it's really useful when you're applying for a job to kind of dig deep like this on your cover letter and your CV and the job description of what they're asking for, because it allows you to really match what you've got and how it applies to that job. And I've definitely gone through this process and discovered that I can't match it. I can't match what they're asking for from my experience. And that to me is usually a bit of a red flag that it's probably not the right fit for me. And while if you're trying to jump into leadership from a role that is different to leadership will mean that there aren't as many matches, there should still be things that you've done that show that you have the ability to be a leader. And I think if your passion is driving you, that you really want to be a leader, that's usually enough to get it over the line too. So in those times where I have discovered that I've gone through the process and it's not quite fitting for me, I would abandon the process for that particular role. I think it's quite important to remember that throughout this process. So you might get to the end of doing your cover letter and your CV and decide, actually, I'm not going to apply because I can see that there's too many gaps. They really need someone who's an experienced leader, and I'm just not there, and I'm not going to be able to get anywhere with this. And that's okay. I think it's a really good experience to do anyway to get to that point, because then you can spend the time now focusing on, okay, well, what do I need to do to show that I can step up to this sort of level? The other thing is that you might get all the way to the interview and then discover that you're not quite feeling the fit, or some of the things that they've told you about how the organisation work don't really align with how you want to work. For example, they might be saying, we're going to complete remote working in a year and everybody will work from home. And if you're someone who knows that they really need that people connection, you're going to know that that's not really going to work for you, and you're going to find it a real struggle to act as a leader where you're leading the way through transitioning to that process to actually help your team and be a leader in that space if that doesn't align with how you know that you need to work. And I think it's important to remember that the interview is for both sides. It's not just about the recruiter finding the perfect leader, it's also about you finding the perfect organisation to work for. And perfect's probably too perfect. Like, it's never going to be perfect, right? It's still a job. What I like to do is have a little bit of a visualization, if you like, where I think about how I'm going to feel if I was rung and offered the job. Do I feel excited and grateful, or do I feel a little bit sick and regretting that I'd applied? If you're feeling that at all, you really need to trust that, and I think it's much better for you to step out of the process at that point than it is to go through the whole thing and then after 3 months quit, because then it's very hard to get yourself something else. So you've done a great job on your cover letter and your CV, and you've gone through the job description and you've been called and asked for an interview. At this point, I would be thinking you have a very good shot of getting the job. You've landed into the shortlist, and now it's really going to be about what you bring to that interview. You do have to be prepared for anything with the interview process. I've been interviewed online, I've been interviewed in person, I've been interviewed with a panel, I've been interviewed with just one person over coffee. So I think being ready for any style of interview is helpful, but what I would do in preparation for getting that phone call where either you're not successful for an interview or you are successful for an interview, think about what you want to ask if you are successful. So while they'll tell you the structure of the interview, I like to ask who's going to be interviewing me. So that gives you not only the names but the positions of those people that will be interviewing you, because that gives you some really good insight about, okay, who am I actually going to be speaking to? Because you don't want to get to the interview and then discover that the CFO is interviewing you and you thought it was going to be a much lower level interview, because it sets you up a little bit on the back foot. I would then do a little bit of research about who those people are, their positions, who reports to them, and how this role might fit into their structure. I also like to ask if there's anything else I need to prepare for the interview. So you do have to be a little bit careful with this question, because you don't want to sound like, I'm just going to turn up to the interview unprepared in my sneakers. It's more is there anything else that you want me to prepare? Just in case they say, we haven't got you to prepare anything, however, we are going to ask you to speak in front of the team and introduce yourself. And then you're ready. You're in the right mindset to be introduced to a bunch of people if that was the case. Some will pitch the interview as an informal chat, and it could be over coffee, which I have experienced before. Don't be fooled by that. Still dress for the interview, and still remember this is their way of getting to know you a little bit better to check if you're the right fit for their organisation. Do need to be yourself so that you know for both sides you're the right fit, but also know that they will be noting what you're saying and how you're talking, so don't be too casual. So now you do some preparation. Go back over your cover letter, go back over your CV, go back over the job description, and start preparing for what the interview could look like. There's lots of free resources on the internet for preparing for an interview. I would go through a couple of the templates and just come up with some rough answers of how you'd answer some of the typical interview questions that you might expect. And also note down those examples that you will use for certain types of situations that you think could come up in the interviews. I also think it's good practice to go in with some questions. You'll obviously want to know the basics about how big the team will be. Usually they will give you that information right up front. However, there might be some other nuances that might be quite good to have, such as how mature is the team that you're leading. It's always good to know if it's a brand new team or it's a team that's been together for a long time, because there's different aspects of leadership that apply to both scenarios that are quite different. And I think it shows good insight to be able to ask questions such as that, because you're also thinking, okay, what kind of leadership style am I going to bring to a team that has been together for 10 years and have seen all the changes in the organisation and know more than I do about how the organisation operates. Asking them questions also shows that you're really interested in the role and that you're prepared to do a good job of being ready for an interview, which usually shows that you're going to be prepared to put in the work in the role too. Now, the final thing is be yourself. Don't leave the video. I know everyone says be yourself, but I do actually have a really good reason for this. If you turn up to the interview and you've got a real veneer of being really professional and really put together, and you have all the answers down pat and you're really well rehearsed, it isn't going to give the interview a really good sense of who you are, and they're going to notice. What I really want to hear when I'm interviewing somebody is how they are when they're a little bit more relaxed. So that's why when you go into an interview and they say, oh, we want you to relax, here's some water, let's do some warm-up questions first to make you feel comfortable, because what it really shows is how you are under pressure. So can you be calm under pressure and professional and not panic? But it will also show how you're going to fit into the culture of the team that they want to place you in, and whether or not they can work with you. And if you're uber professional, they're not going to be able to tell whether or not that's going to work for their team or not. And I think part of an interview is putting you under pressure to see how you're going to cope in that environment when you're under pressure with your team, and how you're going to be able to pull yourself out of it and still be articulate and communicate well. I also consider if an interviewee is giving me quite robotic answers to questions and not really showing any emotion, I also wonder what else is going on underneath. As an interviewer, that can make you nervous enough to not appoint that person, because how do you know what you're going to get in the role? And does that mean that if something's happening, are they going to tell me as their leader what's going on so that we can deal with it together? Or are they going to continue to give a veneer of everything is fine and it's all under control and actually it's blowing up? If you get through this whole process, then you discover that you've been turned down for the role, make sure that you take the opportunity to get some feedback. I know it's really painful, but if you can get some feedback on maybe how you presented yourself in the interview or what you could do better next time, then you can use that to improve. And also, they will remember that. Because if you were a close runner, and they may not tell you that, but if you were a close runner and then you say, hey, I really appreciated you interviewing me and you taking the time, can you give me some feedback so that I can do better next time? Then they may be thinking about you if they need to hire another leader. So don't close the door on that opportunity and how you respond to the decline. Now, look out for some tips that I'm going to do in a future video on what I want to hear from aspiring leaders. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.